Well, welcome to Four Trans Guys. I'm Megan.
I'm Zander.
I'm JJ.
And I'm Reid.
Awesome. Welcome to the show, Reid. So glad you're here.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Very cool. So we always start out by having our guests, the fourth trans guy, tell us a little bit about who they are and what brings them to the table. So who are you and what brings you to the table?
Well, I'm a 70-year-old trans guy and about 30 something years into transition. I started transition when I was 40. And I'm not exactly sure what to say because the elevator speech would have to be a pretty long elevator to really encapsulate my whole life. I'm not sure what else to say about that. So just ask me questions.
Well, is there anything about yourself that would help people sort of understand some of the intersections of who you are? Some people have shared about their cultural background, about where they grew up, about some of the jobs they've done. Are there any of those that you think would be a great spark
Well,
to think of?
Sure. I transitioned out of lesbian community back in 1974. I grew up in San Francisco, for context. So 1974, San Francisco, that place was bursting at the seams with lesbian and gay energy. But there was really no trans energy. So I fell in love with a woman in junior college and I thought, oh, I must be a lesbian. It seemed to explain everything because I really was in love with her. That part was accurate. But did that really mean I felt comfortable being a woman? That wasn't a question that I understood I needed to ask. I didn't know anyone at that time who had asked that question or answered it. There were people, but they were completely invisible. So 20 something years later, a partner came out to me and said, I've always felt like a man inside, and if I had the money, I'd have an operation tomorrow. My partner had never known you could transition. But my partner had always known who he really was. That was the big difference between us. I had not known who I was, but that put it in my face and forced me into the realization. But I have no regrets about having lived over 20 years in lesbian community, because one thing that means is that now I can talk to groups of lesbians about trans identity and they listen to me, they believe me, and they trust me. So I have no regrets about not having transitioned at 19 because it gave me a life experience that is irreplaceable. I couldn't do the work that I've done. I do a lot of trainings about intergenerational issues in queer community. I talk to lots of people with lots of different kinds of identities. And even if I don't share their identity, I know what it feels like to question your identity. I know what it feels like to move through the world having people make assumptions about you based on an identity that many people take for granted. So it's been a huge blessing to me, and I have no regrets at all about having had to wait till I was 40 to understand myself.
Well, and that's one of sort of the interesting things that happened, because in the 70s, all around the Bay Area, there was this sort of beginning of medical culture trying to understand trans stuff, but it was mostly doing that from the perspective of trans women. And a lot of different bumper sticker phrases kind of come out of that time about being trapped in a body or knowing it forever and just not knowing how to describe it. And for a lot of trans guys that come out of that era, they don't really resonate necessarily with that description, which always was a non-trans person's description about what the process looks like. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what was the process like as you started? Like you mentioned, kind of slowly understanding what was going on for yourself. What was that conversation like with the medical people that often become a part of the conversation? Because some people just imagine like it is today that you can show up at a doctor's office and people there might understand what you're talking about. But for many of us, we had to bring in the medical research to our medical people because they just were not familiar with any of it. What was your journey like?
Well, in that sense, it wasn't so bad because I lived in Portland. And at that time, we're talking mid 90s here. And at that time, there were 3 or 4 surgeons on the North American continent that had a great familiarity with trans surgeries. And one of them was here. Toby Meltzer was here at that time. There was one therapist who understood anything about trans issues, and I happened to luck into finding her. But most of the therapists that I'd seen before I lucked into finding her, they didn't understand. They were going by the DSM model. So it's not like they were trying to talk me out of it. I went to a gay and lesbian counseling center first because, having lived in lesbian community for 20 something years, of course, that was my natural response. But they didn't really understand. And when I told my therapist, no, I've only understood my identity for about a week, she thought that can't be it, because the DSM said you had to have conscious knowledge of why you felt anxiety and depression all these years. You had to know it was about gender, and I had not known that. So she thought, oh, that can't be it. It must be something else. So she made a snap judgment about my identity, and it set me back in my process. And I thought later, when I worked with the therapist who did understand better and I got more centered in myself, I looked back at that first therapist and I thought, I can do better than that. So I went back to school and became a therapist for that exact reason. That was my motivating factor. I thought, this is not okay, because this is Portland. They weren't trying to talk me out of it because of any kind of religious or political or conservative issue at all. They just didn't believe me because I didn't match the DSM. And in my work with clients over the years, I came to realize that my story, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. I wasn't comfortable. I had a lot of anxiety, depression, didn't understand until something happened and it became clear to me. Half my clients had that story. The other half had the story of, I knew from the age of 3. I knew from before I could talk. So it's two different stories that I heard. And I've come to the conclusion it's actually two different kinds of identity. And I don't think we've really worked through that yet, because the story is so different that I don't think it's exactly the same thing going on. I don't know what it is, but I can see that there's something different, very different, fundamentally different about our experience of transition and identity.
And I appreciate that you framed it that way, because you were one of the authors in the book Letters from My Brothers, that I don't know how it's been this much time, but came out 15 years ago. And by the time this podcast comes out, we'll have the 15th anniversary edition out in the world for people. The kind of premise that Zander and I had when we started that was this idea that, like, well, 15 years ago, the internet was sort of new. And if you there were a lot of people who had memoirs. There was a lot of like public journaling that was beginning. Now it's even more so, where people can tell you their immediate opinion about what just happened. And so some of the information you might get about what it's like to be trans might be really young and not necessarily from 30 years in. And so the original idea of the book was like, reflect on what your young trans self, what information do you wish you could communicate backwards? And so I'm curious, if you had to communicate backwards to your young self who was trying to figure out how to talk to these therapists who didn't know what was going on and sort of dismissed you because they had never heard of someone like you yet, like how would you describe your journey now that you've seen other people who have a similar way of the discovering? What would you say with advice back to yourself about how you could name and claim that journey?
I would tell myself to hang in there. And I feel very fortunate that when I started transition was right around the time of the very first F2M conference in San Francisco. I realized who I was not long after that conference. And I just feel so blessed that all these trans men were in my life already. I didn't feel so isolated like previous generations had, because people had no incentive to come out whatsoever. So there was no community to plug into. But here in Portland, there was a few. And nationally, there were a number of people I had great email correspondence with during those early years. So that's what I would tell my younger self is hang in there, because you will find community and you will figure out who you are. And yes, you have to go through this therapist system in order to get hormones and in order to get surgery. It was much more gatekeeper then than it is today. And yes, you have to do that, but go for it, do it, and don't hold back. Become your true self, because you will.
Amazing. Something you said kind of really tickled me was you didn't find the answers, so you went back to school to go and get them and figured out an entirely new way of looking at all of what we're doing with identity. And that's fabulous. And something that resonated then with me was I went back to school for my master's of divinity, similarly to be a chaplain, to heal some of my own core wounds and to figure out some of that for myself. So I was curious if that was a healing journey for you. And what does healing look like now?
Yes, going back to become a therapist was totally a healing journey, because one of the things I had to do in figuring out what's my master's thesis going to be about, I came across the idea pretty easily and pretty quickly. And that was that my journey had to do with identity emergence. And when I looked at it that way, it's very similar to going back to childhood and growing up again, this time in the right gender. And so I applied some of the principles of child development and human development to the process of transition. And that was my master's thesis. And that became the thesis of how I worked with my clients. Because if you start taking hormones, you're going back to adolescence and growing up again. And if you're 45 years old holding down a job, you're not really, your coworkers are not expecting you to act like a 14-year-old all of a sudden, but you are. And how do you navigate that space? So it was a healing journey for me in grad school to realize that that's what I was really going through. I was essentially in late adolescence in grad school at the age of 42. So it was a very odd kind of experience, but it helped me hone in on what was going on for me. And then that in turn helped me help my clients hone in on what was going on for them later.
That's amazing. And that's kind of my experience. I've really been through this journey now medically over the past 3 to 4 years. So I'm relatively new. I'm in my 40s, right? And I feel like, where's my dad to teach me like how to work with the hair, and where's the right? And so part of this community is my community, right? Like building this podcast is helpful for me. And I'm wondering, did anybody walk alongside you as you were going through this? You mentioned some groups and some communities. Like, how did that work for you? What would that look like?
Well, the interesting thing is there weren't that many trans men here locally to me that I knew of, because they would transition and disappear into the woodwork, and I didn't know who they were. So I knew people by email, but the people that were most helpful to me as mentors here were actually gay men. Because early after grad school, I joined a mixed chorus. When I moved back to Portland after grad school, I joined a mixed chorus. And when I started to grow a beard, I was complaining to one of them. I said, is it always going to itch like this? Because when you first start growing the beard, it itches like crazy. And the guy said, no, that'll pass after, give it a month or so and it won't itch quite so much. So I found my mentors among gay men about how to navigate this space. Not that I really talked to them a lot about other effects of the hormones, but I knew that I could if I really needed to. And that kind of helped me branch out and form community in new ways that I might not have thought to do otherwise. Because having transitioned out of lesbian community, it was really the first time I'd ever kind of seen gay men as part of my peeps. Because I was part of lesbian community in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s. And the separation between lesbian and gay community was pretty complete at that time. There wasn't a lot of overlap. So I really didn't have any friends who were gay men until I started transition.
That's amazing. And like, you're surviving in a very unique way at this point, right? And I'm wondering, how did that transition into some, like you now, how did you become into kind of, I assume, thriving and being a whole you? How did that evolution happen?
Wow, that's a really good question. A lot of it had to do with being a therapist, because I was able to help so many people. Not just that, but I was able to hear so many stories. And all the stories that I heard just bolstered me in my story somehow. I don't really know how else to put it, because my clients all told very different stories to me, but we had some fundamental things in common. When we were small children, we were not really at home in our own bodies. No matter how we realized that, what life was like through that process, that was a fundamental thing we all had in common. We did not resonate with the gender assigned us at birth. It's about the only thing we all had in common, but we did have that. And that helped me feel less isolated, to hear all these stories that I could just nod my head periodically throughout a client session like, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about here. or wow, that's a very different experience from what mine was, but I see where it came from.
Reid, you and I have some similarities in that I went off to get my master's in social work because I wanted to be able to not be a psychotherapist, but I wanted to do education and
Mm-hmm.
trainings because I
Mm-hmm.
saw that they were either being done by mostly trans women and they wouldn't talk about us at all,
Yeah.
or they was very too general and it wasn't applicable to a number of people. Um, and then letters from my brothers was actually one of the ideas behind it was that there's not one way to be trans or like a trans man, and there's not one way to transition, right? And that's important for people to know. I remember I was talking to somebody, this is when I was at Pacific School of Religion in seminary, where Megan and I met back, what was that, 24 years ago almost now. And I was talking with another student who was a trans man about some experience or thoughts that I had, and because I was wondering, am I a trans person? Like, I was saying I was trans, but it was like, was I a trans man? I was, and what I don't remember what I said to him, but he kind of looked at me and he's like, no, you're not. You're not, right? Because his idea was stuck in you if you're not wanting to kill yourself or feel like you're born in the wrong body. And I was like, well, okay then, because those things are not what's happening for me. But I was paralyzed as a kid and so my relationship with my body, so to speak, and what was expected of me in a Mexican Roman Catholic family around gender, right? So it's like all of these overlaps. You've touched on it slightly, but I'm wondering if we can pivot a little bit into what are your communities and so you talked about being in lesbian community for 20 years and then going to school and becoming a therapist and going into the mixed chorus but like who's been your communities, and who would be your community today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, back in 1986, I was a founding member of the Portland Lesbian Choir. So they just celebrated their 40th anniversary. I have been singing in one queer chorus or another ever since then, because I discovered that singing in a group like that, I don't think it's any accident that choral singing originated in spiritual traditions, because sharing the air in song like that and converging on a single note of unison, it really thins the barriers between all of us and makes us one. We become one voice very easily. And that has been such a powerful, life-saving energy for me. Now I sing in the Portland Gay Men's Chorus, and I have for 18 years. And that's one of my families right there, is the chorus. And in fact, we just sang a concert last weekend called Transformation. And that's exactly what it was about, transformation. And I have never seen trans identity front and center focused by one of the gala choruses. That's the Gay and Lesbian Association of Choruses. So my chorus did that. And I was so proud of them for doing that. And at the end of the concert, 175 members of this chorus, all of the trans and non-binary members came down to the front of the stage holding hands. There were almost 30 of us in that chorus.
Wow.
So
I literally felt the welling up as you were just telling that. Like, that's so powerful and moving, Reid.
Extremely. And that's one reason it's one of my families, is because being true to myself and being open about who I am in chorus settings like that brings them along. I wasn't the only one, obviously, with 30 of us in the chorus, but I was one of the first trans members of that chorus. And I've always been out and open about who I am, because what's the point of not being out and open about who I am? Coming out as a lesbian at 19, I have never lived as a, quote, straight person. How could I possibly see myself as a straight man? Yes, I'm still attracted to women, but when I try to think of myself as a straight white man, it makes me laugh. I've lived as a queer person for so long, I just cannot see myself as straight. But I feel I have to wear a neon sign around my neck for people to not see me as straight. So I'm always wearing rainbow things here and there. And everywhere I go, we've got a pride flag outside our front door and things like that. But then people assume I'm an ally. But that's better than assuming I'm some clueless straight white guy. And I don't mean to lump all straight white guys into that category, because I know some really cool straight white guys who are complete allies. But still, I can't see myself as straight. So I've always seen myself as part of queer community. And I don't really have that many trans men in my life at this point. Partly because at 70, I don't get out that much. I'm not all that mobile anymore. So I don't do much other than go to chorus rehearsal and things like that. But yeah, I think that's where my peeps are, is in chorus.
Well, you have such a maybe the way that I would say it is like you've had this journey about different ways that I would call it becoming mature. If becoming mature is like not just like simply the art of aging, but is like when there is this narrative outside of you that you sort of live into in your early years, and then I think there's a phase of life where people are told where the boundaries are that you can't cross, and so we don't. And then I think in some ways becoming mature is being willing to like not care so much about the verbal boundaries. Obviously we care about like consent and sexuality, but in our own journey and naming who we are, to be able to like mature into proper definitions, proper ways of living our professional life, proper ways of finding our romantic life. And I've just been very impressed that you're someone who hasn't needed to like call yourself names because you were in a different place in the past than you are now, and or that other people are living in a different place than you live. And so that's a beautiful gift, I think, to the kind of maturity I hope that our full world will have. And what I think these conversations on this podcast are about is letting people have their lived space without needing to change them or make them different or insist that people agree or use the right language in the same way. And so I just wanted to like appreciate the ways that you have brought that into this conversation. And because you do work that is caring for others, and also you do a lot of writing, I'm wondering if you would like people to connect with you, what is the way that you would like them to do that?
Well, yeah, they can reach out through my website. It's reidvanderburgh.com, and there you go. I even spelled my name right. Good. Doesn't happen all the time. Yeah, I really love to connect with people, and I love to connect people with each other. I teach a lot of classes. I used to teach a lot of continuing education classes when I was a therapist. I taught 3 a year through PSU, Portland State University, because I wanted other therapists to understand what they needed to know to be of best service. I didn't want people to have the experience I did back in 1995. That's the bottom line. And I think these days they don't, at least not here in Portland. They don't. But I really enjoy connecting people with each other who might feel like they wouldn't necessarily connect. And I'm going to tell a bit of a story here. Some years ago, I was invited to record as backup vocalist with a lesbian singer-songwriter here who's really iconic, Naomi Littlebear. And during the recording rehearsals, we were standing around in her kitchen, and I was the only person there with a testosterone-influenced voice. So everybody else there, and I was singing in the same octave with everybody else, and I just felt the love. I felt like I was back in the Portland Lesbian Choir again. It was so fabulous. And at the end of the rehearsal time, one of the people referred to me as she. Now, this is someone who had never done that before. We've been friends a long time, and I puzzled about it on the way home, and I thought, something happened in that singing circle that did that. And as I got home, I realized what it was, that in that space in time, she had basically made me an honorary lesbian again. And I felt so thrilled. I thought, that is so perfect. So now I refer to myself as an honorary lesbian trans man. And I would only say that because it was a lesbian who conferred that honor on me. I would not take that for myself, but she did in that space. And it connected me back to my past self in a new way that I hadn't experienced before. It was fabulous. So reconnecting my past and present and future has really been powerful for me. Very powerful.
Well, you reinforced my idea of you as a mature person we can all learn from, because a lot of people would just stick in their own hurt of that moment, right? And
yeah.
or insist the whole world shift, which hey, if people are able to make that happen, that would be lovely, right? But such a mature reaction to be able to think through, like, wait, what really did happen?
Yeah.
And is what happened, am I uncomfortable with it, right? To like assess a hurtful thing that happened could also come from like a helpful celebratory thing that happened, right? Both existed for you. And so anyway, I just appreciate you. I'm excited we're going to get to spend more time together in Portland soon. I hope everyone's going to come out to the Bold Cafe on July 31st.
I'll be there.
Yeah. and I want to give you the opportunity as we kind of close our podcast time to let you have your final say in whatever words are in your heart that you want to share with people.
I would just encourage everybody, I don't care who's listening to this, everybody has identities to delve into and figure out who they are and center into. It doesn't matter if you're cisgender, trans, non-binary, just dive deep, because this is an identity that's put on us from birth, and then we're taught how we're supposed to live it. But that doesn't mean that's necessarily reflective of who we are. So I would encourage everybody, just dive deep and let whatever's going to come to the surface come to the surface, because it's who you are. And you owe that to yourself to honor yourself and live who you are.